So hi everyone, my name is Alyssa. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Presence Collective coordinator. We are doing this series every single Thursday, 2 p.m. PST, 5 p.m. EST. And today we have Michelle Johnson with us. Michelle Johnson, she, her, is a social justice warrior, author, dismantling racism trainer, empath, yoga teacher, and practitioner, and an intuitive healer. With over 20 years of experience leading dismantling racism work and working with clients as a licensed clinical social worker, she has a deep understanding of how trauma impacts the mind, body, spirit, and heart. Her awareness of the world through her own experience as a Black woman allows her to know firsthand how privilege and power operate. So thank you all for joining today. These are always donation-based. No one turned away due to lack of funds, and this platform runs through donations from all of you. So thank you for supporting financially, and thank you for supporting with your presence. And I'm excited to have Michelle speak.
Thank you, Alyssa, for all that you have done to bring this together. And welcome, everyone. It's good to be here with you. Good to see some familiar faces and names. I am thrilled to be spending time with you. As Alyssa said, my name is Michelle Cassandra Johnson, and I live in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. That's where I am right now. And I would like for us to begin with a meditation, a centering, just to arrive in the space and to begin to practice. And so I invite you to find a comfortable way to be, if that's possible for you. And I'm sitting in a chair. You might sit in a chair or sit on the floor or stand, whatever would feel most comfortable at this time. Make sure you're well supported. So if you have any pillows or blankets near you or whatever you need, something that feels comforting, just make sure you feel well supported. And take a moment to presence yourself. So in your physical space, you might notice the parts of your body that are touching the earth. And take a moment to presence yourself and your physical body. Now I invite you to turn your attention to your breath. Locate the breath and begin to feel your inhales and exhales. And now begin to deepen and lengthen your breath in your body. Can you find a deeper breath? Can you settle into your body a little more? And can you begin to settle into this present moment? And as you settle into this present moment, take a moment to notice how you feel. And as you ask yourself how you feel, you might notice an awareness of physical sensations, an awareness of emotions moving through. An awareness of the quality of the thoughts, if there are thoughts moving through your mind. An awareness of your spirit and how your spirit feels at this time. And now I invite you to bring your awareness back to the breath, your cycles of breath and our collective cycles of breath. And take a moment here to let your body breathe. Just take a moment to let your body breathe. And for these next few cycles of breath, I invite you to ask yourself why you practice. Why do you engage in spiritual practice? Why is it important to practice? And take 5 deep breaths in and out. And continue to breathe deeply and to bring your awareness to the breath, your cycles of breath. And as you are ready, if your eyes are closed, you might blink them open and just take a moment to reorient to your space. So once again, maybe you'll notice the parts of the body touching the earth, or if there are things around you that you can see, you might notice colors, shapes, objects, the weather outside. Just reorienting to your space and then this virtual space. So, we're going to talk about why we practice and what it means to practice at this time. And before we do that, I know I asked you in the meditation to contemplate, sit with why practice, why is it important? And normally I would have people call that into this space. We have a fair amount of people and a limited amount of time. And so I'm going to invite you to, if you'd like, to chat in the chat box. You can put a word that represents why you practice or why it's important, or a sentence. But I invite you to use the chat box to answer that question, why practice? And I will read some of the things back that you share. To heal, wholeness, purpose and perspective, self-love, connect to humanity, wanting to be mindful and wake up, collective healing and liberation, taking care of others, to feel and to feel alive, happiness, to find ultimate truth, keep going, keep growing, awareness of self and others, clarity, moral vision, more liberation, beyond habit, growth, healing, collective healing, a lot of collective healing, compassion, clarity, perspective, grounding, wakefulness, and growth, to release pain or anger, grounding in the moment, releasing body trauma, purpose, connection to God, self, and others. And you can continue to share innate interconnection in the chat box, and I will reflect more of your answers back to the large group to keep evolving and growing. And I asked this question because, one, we have many different ways of practicing. Okay, I got muted for a minute. Thanks, Alyssa. That was my dog Jasper on cue, barking. He's practicing protecting me right now and always when I'm talking on Zoom. But I asked that question about why we practice because, and why it's important. Because I feel like while every moment is a time to practice and an opportunity to practice, we're in a moment right now where we need our practice to do all the things that you named, right? To connect, to remember our humanity, to evolve and grow, to release pain, anger, and emotions, and trauma, to remember we are divine beings, right? To connect with God, ourself, and others, for our collective healing and liberation, all of the things, purpose, to remember our purpose, to ground. And we need all of these things to resource ourselves at this time and to show up in this moment, which I'll talk some about. I do want to say a little bit more about who I am and why I practice. And as I said, my name is Michelle Cassandra Johnson, and I'm based in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I am, as Alyssa read, I've been teaching yoga for about 11 years. I'm a yoga teacher, although I came to the practice sooner than that time of going through teacher training. And when I went into teacher training, I was a dismantling racism trainer, and I've been doing that kind of work for over 20 years. And I am a licensed clinical social worker, although I'm not practicing right now and still licensed. I'm doing intuitive healing work with clients and coaching work with people who are interested in understanding more about how to dismantle racism and look at their patterns around cultural conditioning. And I'm also doing coaching with yoga practitioners and people who are in yoga communities or spiritual communities or own yoga studios to understand how to create more inclusive spaces. And I wrote a book called Skill in Action, which is about the intersection of justice and yoga. And I want to say something about why I practice and how I came to the practice. And I'm pausing because I think that the practice is everything. So I think I've been practicing for a very long time and practicing trying to remember I am a divine being and connected with spirit and connected with all beings, even as we are having different experiences as we navigate through the culture, which I'll name more about in a little bit. But I came to the practice of yoga more consistently when I think I was seeking some tools to ground. And I wanted to deepen my spiritual connection, and I wanted to deepen my connection with God. And I think I wanted to do that because I was well aware at the point when I started practicing consistently that I was in a culture that really does not see me as a divine being or as connected to spirit because of my Blackness. And my practice time and time again has been like a space where I can witness my own individual patterns and then decide how I want to respond. And my practice has been a space where I can learn more about discernment to then figure out how I want to show up for myself and others and this planet and in the world. My practice has been a place where I have grieved very deeply and continue to do that, not only for my own individual losses, but for the collective losses we have been and are experiencing right now. And my practice has been a place, a shelter, I'm thinking about the Gita now, and I wasn't going to talk about the Gita, but been a shelter when I felt deep despair, which I move around with a lot and a lot of heartbreak. And my practice has been a place where I can go, or a place I can remember, or resources I can engage when I'm not sure what else to do. And that's a little bit about my practice and why I practice. And I want to share a quote with you. So I'm going to share my screen for a moment. So I mentioned that I have been teaching yoga for 11 years, and I remember the day after the election of Trump in 2016, I had to go and teach, and I found this article that was in Lion's Roar, which is still available, where there were quotes from different spiritual leaders and Zen Buddhists about how we could respond to the outcome of that election. And I just pulled one of the quotes from it that I want to read. And then I want to talk about the now we are practicing for. So today, after the 2016 elections in the US, we are living out the example of what happens when what goes unacknowledged surfaces. And it feels like a new reality, but you know in your heart it is not. To suffer based on expectations is to live haunted and hunted, but we are fortunate. There could be no other answer to our meditation and prayers in dissolving hatred than to be placed front and center with it and be exposed. When a shift in a system has occurred, especially one that causes fear and discomfort, it allows for something strikingly different to appear, furthering our evolution as people. We can only know where we are going when we get there. Now is the time we have been practicing for. And there were many quotes in that Lion's Roar article, many teachings and offerings, and this one stood out to me as I reflected on the article again in preparation for this conversation in this space, because what was being offered was in response to the election in 2016, and I think everything that is in this teaching is happening now. And so I want to share some about the now we have been practicing for. And, you know, I will say most of the quotes that were offered, the teachings, the theme was like, we have been practicing for this. Like, this is what we need to show up for. And so I want to say the this. And the this I will offer is just based on my perspective and lived experience. And I'm well aware that we are having different experiences as we breathe and move and try to remember our humanity and our shared humanity. So I've been saying this a lot. I am almost 45. I'll be 45 in August. And as far as I know, in this body, in this lifetime, I've never lived through a pandemic. So that's part of what the now is. And as I understand it, and again, I'm in North Carolina, we are in phase 2, and the governor decided yesterday to keep us in phase 2, which I'm grateful for because the numbers are going up of positive test results for COVID. And I know that's happening in a lot of places in the country and the world. And so we're in the now of the pandemic where people of color, in particular brown and Black folks, are disproportionately affected by COVID, therefore dying from COVID, and not just COVID, but systemic racism. And so part of the now is systemic racism, which is not new, as this quote says. What is happening right now is things that have been not, what is the word I want to say? Things that people may not have been present to, and things that people may not have noticed or may not have needed to notice that have been under the surface. Those things are coming up to the surface now. And we're having to like contemplate, how do we practice now? How do we respond to these things now? And the reason I framed it that way is because in my experience as a Black person and person of color, there hasn't been a moment where I have not thought about racism and where I have not thought about white supremacy or my Blackness. And for those of you who've read the book, my white supremacy is in my birth story, based on how I came in and how my mother was treated when I came in. And so some of us have been well aware of the now related to white supremacy and racism, and there's definitely an awakening happening, or a reawakening, I'm not sure. Or a level of discomfort that people must respond to. I think a lot of different things are happening right now. And part of the now is the uncovering of, or the remembering that police brutality is something that is rampant in our communities, and systemic racism is rampant in our criminal justice system and in every institution, and in our spiritual communities. I'm talking about racism, but I also want to name racism is connected to all forms of oppression. So we have systemic oppression where people who are trans, people living with disabilities, people who are undocumented, women, right? I'm not naming every group, but are being affected by systemic oppression and being exploited and being made invisible and being tokenized and being oppressed, as I'm naming. So the now is the pandemic, the now is police brutality and systemic racism, the now is people waking up to white supremacy and that it is a real thing. The now is social media reminding us that white supremacy is real. The now is elevating Black voices that have not been centered and elevating voices of people who've been marginalized by systems. These voices are being centered. The now is the dismantling of white supremacy and a look at capitalism, hopefully a dismantling of it. And the now is taking down Confederate statues. And the now is like reckoning. The now is reckoning for, based on the identities you might embody that are privileged. And in particular, I will racialize it. I think the now is the reckoning for white people to decide what they want to do to dismantle whiteness and all the ways in which it is harming Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and all the ways in which it's harming white people. Because I always say that white supremacy harms us all. It's just happening in different ways. The now is the devastation of the planet and climate change, which, as we know, has been going on for a while, and everything we do affects everything that happens. And the now is like, remembering that our actions affect every being, every energy, and the planet we inhabit. The now is war and violence. And the now is also resilience. And the now is, for people who've been marginalized, taking up space that is theirs, is their birthright. The now is remembering that liberation as our birthright. And the now is an opportunity for us to live into our collective humanity. So again, that's just from my perspective. There's more that I could say about the now. That's what's coming through me at this moment in time. And I think this is the now we've been practicing for. And I want to share some about how we can engage the practice and some ways that I was just looking at the chat. I can stop sharing now. I left that up just so people could see it, but I'll stop sharing it now. I want to talk, but actually I will look at it. I want to share some about spiritual practice and how it supports us. So as far as I know, you cannot see my screen now. And I'm mainly talking about my experience of, as I said earlier, remembering I am spirit and connected to God, and how that shows up for me is to move through a practice of yoga. And I don't just mean physical movement. I also mean meditation and prayer and ritual and ceremony and study and reverence, right? And humility and surrender. And as I named earlier, remembering my connection with other beings and energies and the planet. And so what spiritual practice, I think, helps us do and has equipped us to do in this moment is to be with the discomfort that arises when we're in the middle of reckoning with what is, based on our positionality, meaning based on the identities we embody and how we're positioned to either have power or have power taken away. And I think also, like, spiritual practice allows us to be with the discomfort that just comes from being in a body, moving on a planet where there is so much, I've been saying this a lot, misalignment, so much trauma happening and collective trauma, and where we don't actually have spaces to like process the grief connected to the trauma. And so the practice, whatever your practice is, can allow you to be with discomfort. And I was leading a call the other day, a workshop, and it was a mixed space racially and other identities too. And there was a white woman, we were talking about rest, and there was a white woman who said, I need to be uncomfortable right now. And I was like, yeah, you might need to be uncomfortable now. Yes. And she was offering this. I was not saying, imposing this on her, but I think she's right. And she was saying it because she had an awareness that people who are marginalized have been uncomfortable. I mean, if I think about Blackness, I've been uncomfortable since I came out of the womb, right? Into a world that does not appreciate Blackness. And I should mention the now is an uprising, a global uprising to say Black Lives Matter. That's the now too, that's happening. And I didn't mention it earlier. And so when this white woman said, like, I need to be uncomfortable, and we were talking about spiritual practice, and I was like, and maybe I need a yoga nidra, maybe I need to rest as you are like reckoning and being with your discomfort and contemplating how you want to show up in the world at this time. Spiritual practice allows us, I think, to witness ourselves, to witness our assumptions, our belief systems, our patterns. And through witnessing, there's some opportunity to shift our patterns, right? And practice discernment and contemplate why patterns are in place and how they might be affecting us and others. So there's that piece that practice helps us do. And I also think in this moment, spiritual practice and why we practice to meet the moment is to hold the various perspectives and experiences that people are having in response to the now, the things I named about the now. And what I mean is that in my experience in dominant culture has made an assumption that we are having the same experience, or that we is saying we're having the same experience, and then it's also othering people based on their identities, that it has constructed. It's doing both. And as I always say, it's doing many other things. And so there was some narrative about the now that I named from dominant culture, that we are in this moment together. And spiritual practice would actually say that too, because there is no separation. And I agree with that as an absolute truth, that there is no separation, that we are one, that we are navigating a time collectively that we have not navigated before. And we are like trying to figure out how we're going to respond and who we're going to be, like who we are going to be as a collective. That is what we are contemplating at this moment. And so there was narrative about like, we're all in this together as if we're having the same experience. And I actually think spiritual practice and why we practice, one reason is to help us hold the multiple truths and perspectives that are centered when there are people set up to have power, and people, as I named earlier, where power is being taken away. Systemically, not just individually, right? Because all of us have personal power, which spiritual practice can help remind us of our personal power, our agency, and it can allow us to understand, I've mentioned this word positionality, it can allow us to understand how we're positioned, and then what kind of action we want to take in response to the now, whatever the now is for you. Several people mentioned that spiritual practice in the chat box helps them stay grounded and centered. So it can allow us to feel the physical earth, right? Notice we are in bodies, and allow us to be embodied as we are feeling all of the identities we embody. And it can allow us to center and you know, for me, spiritual practice at times allows me to slow down, even if for a moment, to slow down and breathe and remember the ground is there. So, and to calm my nervous system, so then I can figure out, like, what do I want to do in this next moment, right? How do I want to meet the next moment from a place that's grounded and centered? That is not always possible for me, but when I remember my practice, then it is possible for me to take a moment to come back to myself, to then figure out who I'm going to be in the external world, right? And what I'm going to do, what is the next move I want to make. Spiritual practice, and I named this earlier, allows us to see our identities and how dominant culture has positioned us. And as I named, we're uniquely positioned, we have agency, and I work with a lot of different people who at times feel like they don't have agency and they can't do anything about what is happening. And some of that, I think, comes from the overwhelm that can happen in the nervous system, because so many things are coming at us rapidly and we're being asked to respond, right? And so I understand that overwhelm is real. And I feel like we need to work to understand our positionality so that we can, because I think we have a responsibility to one another and to the planet. That's what I believe. And we actually can't afford to not practice, right? And as the quote said, that was in 2016, right? Almost 4 years ago. And it's still so relevant now. And so a lot's at stake. And part of understanding our positionality and engaging in the practice to see how culture positions us. Because spiritual practice might say something different about our identities, and that we're not our identities, but we are in bodies moving in a culture that has created identities that we have to then contend with and respond to and reckon with. And so I invite us to think about how are we positioned, and what do we want to do given our responsibility to care for one another. Spiritual practice, this is something I talk about a lot, the breath, and I invited you in the meditation to breathe. And I know that's pretty common for meditations and spiritual practice, to come into the breath, to come into the body, to come into awareness of what is present and happening in the present moment. And I want to say that, and many of you who know me know this, that how I think about the breath and spiritual practice is that, connected to our responsibility to care for one another, is that we need to make space for others to breathe. And I didn't just come up with this yesterday. And it's not directly in response to the murder of George Floyd, although it was a reminder of why this came to me. The first time I started talking about oppression, living in a culture where oppression takes the breath away, is after Eric Garner was murdered. And I went in to teach yoga at noon, kind of like I went in to teach after the election, and needed to read these quotes to people to center them because they were in deep sorrow about the results of the election. But after Eric Garner was murdered, I went into class and I just said, oppression, we live in a culture where oppression takes the breath away. And that was kind of the moment where I started to think about the breath in a different way, because the breath is life. And the now, the things that I was talking about related to systems and the pandemic and what is being revealed and exposed, like that is evidence that we're in a culture where that's set up for oppression to take the breath away. And so part of connecting to the breath and understanding that people don't have space to breathe is also leaning into how we might make space for others to breathe. And you might equate this with privilege, right? So if you have the privilege, right, based on your identities, if you have white privilege or male privilege, or you're heterosexual and have privilege, right, or you're able-bodied and have privilege, there are many privileges. And there are many, if you're middle to upper class, right, and not struggling financially and economically, if you have a home, right, these are all privileges. And so with our privileges comes great responsibility to leverage our privilege to make space for others to thrive. And so you can equate the breath with thriving, with liberation, right, with self-determination around what liberation looks like. Spiritual practice and why we practice can help us stay present to what is happening. So I named several things about the now. So spiritual practice can help us respond to what is the now, and to like really see what the now is instead of going back to sleep, which again, the overwhelm of the nervous system might make you want to do that. But we're in a moment, where we have to stay, awake, where we need to be in this awakening and present to what is. And the reason that we need to be in this awakening is so we can contemplate and vision what we want to see, right? Like what ought to be in this world, what ought to be created, what we are visioning, which is the opposite of so many of the things that I named about the now. And why we practice and how we practice is to respond to the urgency. So we have urgent concerns. They are not new. But to respond to them with mindfulness. And I want to be clear, I don't mean peacefulness. And I just want to I do not mean that when I say mindfulness, because there's nothing about the systems of oppression that I have named that is peaceful. And so when I say mindfulness, I mean awareness of, I mean like discernment. I mean thinking about risk. I mean noticing who's in the context with us and what they may be risking. That's what I mean when I say mindfulness. I mean resourcing ourselves when I say mindfulness. Like, do I need to go back in and then I can go back in the street and protest, right? Do I need to come back to myself because I'm not embodied anymore, right? I don't feel what's going on, and then I can go back out and take action in whatever way I just named one way, right? Protesting, but take action from a place that's grounded and centered. This is a tension, though. It is very difficult to respond to urgent concerns with mindfulness, in my experience, because so much is at stake, as I named earlier. Why we practice is to remember, and people name this in the chat box, that we are part of a collective and that we are interconnected. And what dominant culture does is it makes us forget that we are interconnected, not just as humans, but, you know, with every sentient being and energy in the planet, right? And the ecosystem we are part of and lucky enough to be part of. And so, you know, an antidote to this forgetting is to remember our connection to everything. And in preparation for this time that we have together, I have 2 beehives, and I'm writing a second book right now about grief, and I'm in the chapter, deep in the chapter about bees. And I sat out next to the hives today and meditated, and I just watched them. And, you know, bees don't see themselves as individual bees. They see themselves as an extension of the hive, which is the collective. And so they're like the perfect metaphor for us to think about when we want to remember being part of a collective, and that everything that they do is for the collective health of the hive, and not just like the hive in this moment, but the hive in 6 weeks when some of the bees will die, right? Because that's their 6 to 8 weeks is how long they live at this time of year. In winter, they live a little longer. They're different bees that are created to survive the winter. So I just invite you all to think about whatever, maybe it's the beehive, maybe it's something else that will remind you that you are part of a collective. And practice helps us see truth, which is connected to what I said about what is, right? What is really happening, which is not easy. I don't think it's easy for people to see what is happening, especially if they're implicated in what is happening. And especially if like an awareness of like being implicated causes dissonance, and then invites people into that dissonance doing something different, right? And taking responsibility. Our practice can help us move through emotions. I mentioned grief, and I mentioned how my practice has helped me move through many different things. So I think this practice and why we practice is to attune to what is present and to notice the emotions, not just our thoughts and our thought patterns and our physical movements, but our feelings and what our nervous systems are doing. And, you know, if we are not able to process emotions or process trauma, and somebody mentioned trauma, releasing pain and anger, then that just stays in the physical body, the energetic body, right? The spirit. And sometimes that makes us, sometimes that creates dis-ease and in the body and in the spirit. And sometimes that creates disassociation and like the amount of emotions on top of other emotions, on top of other emotions filling us up can make us stop moving, can make us stop breathing, can make us stop doing the work we need to do, can make us forget our purpose on this planet. And then the last thing I want to say, and I'm going to open it up for some questions with the time we have left, is that I worked with a group in North Carolina called Dismantling Racism Works for a long time, and we had an assumption, which was just a belief. It was part of our philosophy, which was that none of this is easy and we have to do it anyway. And so like anti-oppression work wasn't easy. And I don't think spiritual practice in the way that I'm talking about it is easy. And I don't think reckoning with the what is as we dream up what we want to see and create is easy. And I don't think responding to urgency with mindfulness is easy. And this is why it's called a practice, right? And I think we have to do all of the things I named anyway, like ground and center and breathe and understand positionality and stay present and break down illusion to see truth and move through our emotions and grieve and remember we're part of collective. And it's not easy because of how the culture is constructed. And there are other things I could say about that, but that's the essence of why I don't think this is easy. Dominant culture hasn't made it easy for us to engage in spiritual practice in the way I'm talking about, which is something greater than me moving on my yoga mat or me sitting on my cushion like I did with the bees today, even though that was beautiful and wonderful, just what I needed. The practice I'm talking about is like how we live, who we are, how we want to be, who we will be. And so that's what I want to invite us into, meeting this moment with the practice and remembering the now we're meeting. And I will pause there and open it up for questions. We have about 15 minutes. So I will open it up for folks to ask questions either in the chat box or unmute yourself, and you can call yourself into this space and ask your question, or you can make a comment. You know, it doesn't have to be a question. That is present, what would you like to say or ask? Your name.
I would love to ask you a question, Michelle. Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm up here in Vermont. Alyssa, thank you for holding space for this and making this possible for us this evening. My question is, and one of the reasons I paused for a long time is because it is a little bit personal. I am a yoga teacher. And I'm looking to continue my practice via the education of social work. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about how you made the decision as a yoga instructor to go into that practice.
To go into social work?
Yes.
So I was a social worker before I was a yoga teacher. And I went to social work school in 96 and finished in 98. I'm saying that because I can't remember. And also I was trying to remember, I went through teacher training in 2009. So 11 years later, went to teacher training. But a lot of people do ask me this question about, because I do many different things, but all of them feel connected to me. And a lot of yoga teachers do go into social work or some sort of like healing, space holding profession. So I can answer the converse of your question. So I went into yoga as a social worker because I was talking to clients about the mind-body connection. And I was practicing yoga too on my own, but I wasn't guiding them through the practices I was offering. So I'd say, you can practice breathing instead of being like, let's breathe for 5 minutes. Right? One day I witnessed myself talking through the thing because I was a talk therapist, right? And I was like, that doesn't make any sense what you just said. Why don't you just breathe with this person? Why don't you just move with this person? Why don't you lead a meditation for them? And I'm sure I did some of that, but I was like, I need to go to yoga teacher training to understand how to integrate this practice into my social work practice. So that's how it happened. And I wonder if it had been the opposite way, if I'd been a yoga teacher before I was a social worker. I think yoga is about healing, and I think social work, and again, people in that kind of profession are engaged in trying to support people in their healing. And so I think there's a natural relationship between the two, and I imagine I would have sought out something like that, right? Social work or something else to expand the ways in which, and my toolbox around the healing tools I could offer. So thanks for your question, Natalie.
Thank you for your time
Mm-hmm.
and all of your work. You're a huge mentor of mine, and I'm happy to be connecting with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So somebody asked in the chat box about maintaining practice when you feel very deep grief. Oh, we could do a whole nother Presence Collective on grief, y'all, because it is on my mind and in my heart, and I'm in my own process of grieving, and I have been for a long time. And I really appreciate this question. And I wonder if like grieving is the practice. That's what I wonder. And if the tips that the person, Riley, you're asking for are really about allowing the grief to move through as you resource yourself, because there's a lot of grief, right? And as I said, like many of the things we're experiencing aren't new, and then there are a few things that are, and there's a way we're experiencing collective grief specific to COVID-19, which is what you referenced. Like, I mean, I've never experienced collective grief in response to a pandemic. Like, I don't know what that is. I'm trying to figure that out, like moment to moment. What does it actually mean to grieve when I'm socially isolating and trying to practice collective care and trying to connect with people, but I can't actually really see very many people. But I want to talk about like the sadness I feel that people are dying, and people are dying alone, and we don't have enough resources to care for people, and some people are set up to be cared for and others are not. Like, that is, the gravity of that is so huge. And so I just want to offer that maybe it's feeling the grief within the, and I think your practice, and I'll speak for myself, I think my practice has held me in my grief. And because I feel a connection with spirit, there have been times when I have offered up the like deep grief to spirit to hold. And that may not be a practice that resonates with everyone here, but maybe it's giving that grief to the earth, right? And I don't mean like putting more on the earth than there is, but I mean, if spirit does not connect with you, is there some other energy or something else that can help support you in the process of grieving, so you remember that you're not grieving on your own? And the other thing, I've interviewed a bunch of people, like 30 some people about grief this past year. And I was interviewing about collective grief and liberation. Then COVID happened, and I did another round of interviews because I didn't know COVID was going to happen. And almost everyone I interviewed said that, I asked about lessons from grief, and they said what they've learned is that they will move through it. And what I'm not saying is time will heal your grief. I'm not saying that right now, because I don't know if that is true. What I am saying is people talked about the overwhelm of their whole being because of the deep grief, the old grief, the ancestral grief, the things we're responding to and grieving in real time right now. And that at some point, the grief didn't feel as intense. And I do know that the intensity of the grief, it comes in waves, because our nervous system can't actually sustain the intensity of what we are grieving, like all of the time, or like so many things will happen to us if our nervous systems try to sustain, right, a response to such deep grief all of the time. So thank you for your question. Any other questions? Thanks for your comments in the chat box.
Hey, Michelle.
Yes.
Hi. I thank you for speaking. And I want to say that you talked about how collective culture, how we're not set up the way the dominant culture is set up. We're not set up to be able to process things in the way to give them their full due, right? And when I think about what's happening now, given in particular COVID, and how that interrupts some of what dominant culture, I want to give thought, or I wonder if you can speak to how we as humans, it's not really a question, but I just keep thinking about, I don't, we don't want to go back to how we were, right? We don't, things aren't working. So how then do we just, yeah, I don't even know if it's a question, but just to say that and to name that, and for have us to, to have people think about that, and to have you say whatever you might say.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to see you too. You're right. I don't want us to go back to how things were, and I don't actually think we can. Like, I don't think at this point that is going to happen. And I think it is the pandemic and then the awakening that is happening, of course, at the expense of people's lives, right? The awakening that is happening and the protest that's happening in response to that all over the world. Like, I think we're like reconfiguring who we are. That's what I do believe that in this moment. I did not believe, I did not, well, I did believe that on some level when the pandemic happened. And then I was more aware of that after, and I know George Floyd was not the only person murdered. And so I'm not naming everyone, but after that point in time, I was like, oh, something is shifting here, right? And I was coaching 2 yoga people yesterday, and one of them said, like, overnight, when COVID happened, and it wasn't quite overnight, we changed how we were. People had to start social isolating. I know everyone couldn't do that, and everyone did not do that. And there were some people who had no choice, like had to go to work, right? People started wearing masks. Of course, some of that has decreased now. People started talking about collective care in a way I've never heard. Collective care has been around forever, right? People have been practicing that, but it was elevated, right? And this person was naming that we changed things rapidly to respond to the pandemic. And when she said that, I was like, oh, then we can change, right? Like, it was like okay. I hadn't thought about it that way before. And it was a gift that she said it, because I was like, because often I'm in the heartbreak and despair and like, I'll do this work, but I don't know if it's going to work, right? I'm in that space. And I was like, we can do this. We can figure out new systems and ways of being, as evidenced by what we did. And I mean, there were a lot of problems with the US's response, to be clear, but like, I saw people trying to practice collective care and mutual aid, right? Which is not new either. But I saw a lot more of that. And just considering like who's at risk, and like my mother has a disability. I haven't seen her in months because I don't want to go to her retirement community and potentially expose people. Like many people are thinking about that, and not just themselves. So that to me suggests that we can create a different way of being. And maybe we're in a moment of doing that. And I'm not clear yet, but maybe we are in a moment of actually making that happen. That's my thought in response to what you named. And thanks for surfacing that. We have time for, I see you, EB, and it's good to see you. You're muted. You want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm thoughtful about your, thanks, Michelle. I'm thoughtful about what you're talking about with regard to rest. And I realize that as I keep keep navigating all the decisions about self-care because of utilizing skills that we have to be effective in the world, that we keep making, and then like each decision that we get to make about self-care, it seems so important to do that so that we're resourced to go out and do good work. And yet it seems like, I don't know, just the privilege of it. And so it's just like, I know it's a balance. We keep bouncing, I keep bouncing back and forth between that and deciding I'm not going to do that. That's too much. I'm going to do this. That is important. I'm going to do Nidra now. That's important. And I'm just curious about your thoughts about that.
I appreciate your question, Evie, and I am someone who believes that dominant culture does not want us to rest. but that's different for different people based on our identities. But in general, I don't think dominant culture wants us to rest. And I don't think rest is prioritized. I think productivity is prioritized, and competitiveness, right? And drive, right? That in my experience is what's prioritized. And people believing that they need to be perfect and overwork and, you know, and that is toxic. And I feel like, so I want everyone here to rest, right? Like whatever practice that is. I don't know all of you and I don't know your identities, and I know we have different identities, right? But I think it's a good practice to rest and practice self-care and resourcing yourself so that you can, as you named, EB, figure out how you want to be, right? There's the internal practice and there's the external practice. There's the like, what do I need to do to resource myself? And then how do I go out and resource in response to what is happening and the trauma that I'm aware of, right? Or subject to. That's how I think about it. And can I practice self-care with an awareness that I'm part of a collective and that some people have not been set up to be cared for? And can I practice self-care and rest with an awareness that based on my positionality and different identities, I haven't had the space to rest. So if I just think about being a Black woman, there are narratives about us enduring things, not being vulnerable, right? Needing to take care of everyone in our community, right? And I'm naming one example of an identity or two identities, just to tell you what I'm talking about, right? And so what that means is I had to learn how to rest, because nothing that I had taken in from dominant culture and then from my own like family and community said rest. What dominant culture said is you need to work twice as hard to prove yourself and to prove your worth, right? And to keep your spot in this organization, whatever it is, right? And what I witnessed my mother doing, and I love her dearly, as you know, was that, I mean, I don't know that she had much space to rest. Like, I don't know that was possible for her. I don't know that she believed it was possible, and I don't know that it was possible. And so that's what I was internalizing and then trying to figure out, okay, I can't keep going. I actually need to be righteous about my self-care in a culture that doesn't want to care for me. And so that's what I'll offer. I mean, I think we need to rest, and we also need to be aware of like, who has the space to rest and take care of themselves and who doesn't, and why is that? And what do we want to do about that? So thanks for asking your question. So I know we are at time, and I know Alyssa wants to say something, I think, at the end. I will just say 3 things. One, it's been a deep honor to be here in this space with you. And I will talk to Alyssa. I would love to talk about grief for a whole while. It's like all I'm thinking about it right now. So I would love to do that. And collective grief and healing. So it's just been a deep honor to be in this space and to practice and talk about practice and to be together in this way. And I want to thank Presence Collective and Peace in Schools for this space and opportunity. The easiest way to find me, and I'll put it in the chat box, is my website. And I cannot talk and type. There's my website. So you can see what's happening, where I'll be, what's coming up, all that stuff there. And I have a lot of things coming up, but I have 2 open workshops, skill and action workshops. That's the title of my book, where we talk about yoga and social justice and the intersection and some of the themes that I raised today. One is in August and one is in September. One is on a weekend, one's a weeknight. They're 3 hours each with a break in the middle. And they include movement and meditation, if you're interested in that. So many things are listed on the website, but those 2 are 2 that came to mind that I thought people might be interested in. And I think those are the 3 things: where to find me, what I'm up to, and thank you for being here. And Alyssa, if there's anything you want to, I don't know if there's anything you needed to say.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I have a few announcements on behalf of Presence Collective. One, we are, like I said in the beginning, we're doing these webinars every Thursday from a different teacher of the collective. Always donation based, no one turned away due to lack of funds. And Michelle, of course, we would love to have you do a topic on grief. I know I would love that. And I speak for a lot of people in that for that. And then the second thing I want to mention is we have 4 teachers in the collective. They're all identify as white, and they are putting on a day of retreat. It's called Caucus to Collectivity: Dismantling Racism from a White Identified Perspective. So this is for people who identify as non-POC, and all the proceeds will go to either the Presence Collective BIPOC Scholarship Fund or Radical Dharma. So I will include these links in the chat. And thank you, Michelle. I really enjoyed today. Thank you for you all for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Alyssa. Thank you, everyone. Take care and be well. And I hope to see you again or be in space with you again. So take care. Thank you.